I don't think people want to live in the kind of world that Donald Trump is creating, a world where violence decides, who's in charge.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. So how do you tell a friend that they're heading headlong down the wrong path? The United States and Australia have been allies for nearly 75 years, and for better or worse, both countries have played a significant role in shaping the world as we know it today. And that relationship goes well beyond politics. Our people share deep connections, whether it's through commerce, education, or family. But now the Trump administration is sabotaging its global relationships and itself.
We are going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not. Iran's formerly supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is dead. The Board of Peace is going to almost be looking over the United Nations and making sure it runs properly. The Somali pirates who ransacked Minnesota remind us that there are large parts of the world where bribery, corruption, and lawlessness are the norm. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets. They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done.
Black voters have been great to me. I've been great to them. And I am, by the way, the least racist president you've had in a long time, as far as I'm concerned.
We have an Insurrection Act for a reason. If I had to enact it, I'd do that.
I have my highest poll numbers that I've ever had. And, based on what I read, I guess I'm not allowed to run. So we'll see what happens.
The time has come. The Australian and US governments need to have a talk, a serious one about consequences and what the relationship can look like moving forward. With me today to discuss the war on Iran, the current state of US politics and the Australia-America relationship is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. G'day, Emma.
Hey, Eb, thanks for having me back.
Absolute pleasure, but not really a pleasure to be talking about the subjects that we'll tackle today. I mean, I really wanted to have a chat with you today because it really does feel like the world has gone to hell in a handbasket in a pretty short space of time. And obviously, we've got the ongoing conflict in Gaza, where we continue to see civilians being killed. But most recently, we've seen the United States and Israel's war on Iran, and that's had huge implications for the rest of the world. And obviously, it's been devastating for the civilian population of Iran. Over the weekend, we saw the United States and Iran participate in negotiations to end the war. Where did those negotiations end up, Emma?
Not in a very good place, Heb. Entirely predictably, when you have somebody like Vice President J.D. Vance leading a diplomatic delegation and laying out uncompromising terms even before the negotiations have started, it didn't go particularly well and ended really in a stalemate with no progress in terms of peace talks after about a day of, I guess, back and forth between two separate rooms. So we're kind of almost even in a worse place than we were before the peace talks, because now, not only has the Strait of Hormuz not reopened, not only have hostilities not ceased, we also have the United States implementing what they're describing as a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, so that those who have negotiated passage through the strait maybe can't get through as well. So it is really an unmitigated disaster, unfortunately, for Iran, for the region, and for the rest of the world.
So if you could just unpack that. So you've got both powers essentially being hostile there, not really doing much to open up the strait.
No, absolutely not. So Trump has kind of, he's flip-flopping, I guess, on the strait being open as a condition of peace. You know, he goes from saying the United States doesn't need the strait, we don't care, to insisting that it has to be open, and sometimes insisting that it has to be under his control or sometimes under joint control. You know, the goalposts shift all of the time. But basically the Iranian regime has said that they won't give up control of the strait, and you know, why would they? Strategically, it's one of their biggest advantages, and the United States has provided no incentive for them to change that. So there was no reason to expect that they would ever accept those terms from the United States. But now Trump has changed the game again and said that the United States is going to institute this naval blockade and stop ships from transiting through Iranian ports in the strait. We don't exactly know what that means yet or what that will look like. And we especially don't know what any pushback will look like if the US Navy is trying to stop ships from transiting through, ships that would have paid a $2 million toll to the Iranian regime. So this is a pretty huge mess, and I think we don't quite know where it's going to go.
So last week, Donald Trump threatened to commit genocide effectively on social media, posting on his Truth Social account that, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. He obviously didn't follow through on that. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you today is for the implications for us as an ally of the United States of those kinds of comments. But obviously, like, that's not a great place to start any negotiations with Iran from either. What was the general kind of response to those completely beyond the pale, almost unhinged comments from the President of the United States?
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start, Ed, because it is appalling. And I think it's already, you know, we're recording on Monday, this happened last week. It's already being, I guess, forgotten about or fallen out of the news cycle. And in that process, it's almost normalized. You know, that's what Trump is so good at really escalating the rhetoric and the threats and making that seem normal. But it is not normal for the President of the United States to threaten to commit genocide, even if it is as some kind of unhinged, as you say, negotiating tactic, which is how Trump supporters are defending it. But what Trump has done is create this escalatory trap for himself and for the United States, where he's constantly ratcheting up the threats and is apparently quite willing to follow through on them. I think we have to remember that as well. You know, 3,000 people at least have already been killed because of Trump and Netanyahu's war on Iran. And he's clearly fine with that. And he's clearly fine with threatening worse. And so I think the global reaction to this is rightly, you know, us all being absolutely appalled that this is happening. But it's also true that allies of the United States are not entirely sure how to react, you know, when they're dealing with such a volatile president. Everybody is treading very carefully, I suppose. So we've had some quite strong reactions from some European leaders in particular, and then we've had more muted reactions from our own Prime Minister, for example, who made the understatement of the decade, I think, when he said that that language was inappropriate.
I don't think it's appropriate to use language such as that from the President of the United States. The conduct of any conflict must be within international law.
If that happened, would that be a war crime? What the President was talking about?
Look, it's a long step between a tweet and that suggestion.
Emma, one of the big issues surrounding the ceasefire has been whether or not Israel's invasion of Lebanon was to be included in the ceasefire. What more do we know about that?
That's right, Eb. This is a really significant issue, and it's one that really unraveled the ceasefire from the start, you know, if we can even really call it a ceasefire. And that's because the Pakistani Prime Minister, who effectively brokered this very temporary ceasefire between Iran and the United States, when he announced the ceasefire, was very clear that Lebanon was included. The Iranian regime clearly was under the impression that Lebanon was included as well. But almost immediately, the Israeli Prime Minister said, no, Lebanon is not included, and initiated a huge wave of strikes that killed 300 people effectively overnight. It was fairly clear that Trump hadn't thought about it, hadn't cared or paid attention. He later just described Israel's war on Lebanon as a separate skirmish and said that it, you know, wasn't related to this particular ceasefire. That is really untenable. You know, these conflicts are clearly deeply related, and Netanyahu has an interest in continuing this war on Lebanon. He's been very clear that, there is no ceasefire, although he is talking about having talks with Lebanon. But it's clear that over the weekend in talks, this has been an issue as well, that the United States is just refusing to move on. And it's clear that they're not really willing to negotiate. They're presenting their maximalist terms while the Iranian regime is effectively doing the same, and nobody is willing to move.
Trump has been complaining very loudly about the unwillingness of the US's allies to get involved here. He's gone everything from calling them cowards to, at the same time, essentially saying, they're not even needed. You've just talked about there's been some pushback, or I guess that some European allies are kind of recalibrating and a bit nervous about how to respond. How has Europe responded, and are other US allies responding? I mean, Europe's just been on the crazy end of kind of preparing for Trump to invade Greenland. They must be operating kind of almost, in a kind of whiplash here. What has the response ranged from amongst the European nations?
We've had a really big range of responses, I think partly for that reason, Eb. It wasn't that long ago that the Danes were preparing themselves for essentially fighting the United States for a US-led invasion of Greenland, to the point where, the Danes were taking enough explosives to blow up the runways in Greenland and taking blood supplies because they were taking these threats, rightly, from the Trump administration so seriously. So Europe, I think, is reeling in that sense from what is essentially the collapse of NATO, even though Trump keeps threatening to break it again. And we have seen some quite strong responses from Spain, from the French, and from Italy as well. They've all closed bases to the United States and said they can't use the bases for operations in Iran, which is pretty significant and has drawn the ire of Trump. He's very upset by this.
Yeah, and I also saw that the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez had also effectively refused to applaud any of the ceasefire kind of talk and just say, I'm not going to applaud someone who sets a fire and then brings the bucket, something along those lines.
It's really striking. But then there's also this tension in Europe because the Secretary General of NATO, Rutte, has been meeting Trump. He met Trump last week in the States, and then, went on US television and effectively tried to talk to the president again to talk about how good he was and how important the NATO alliance is, almost kind of trying to appease the president in that way.
Let me be absolutely clear. He is clearly disappointed with many NATO allies, and I can see his point.
When President Trump threatened to kill the entire Iranian civilization, did that bother you at all as a diplomat?
Well, what I always say when it comes to what leaders are saying, I'm not commenting on everything. What I want you to know is that I support the president, and I know large parts of Europe do, when it comes to taking out the capacity of Iran to export chaos.
Is the world safer today than it was before the war was started?
Absolutely.
So there is absolutely that tension happening in Europe. But what I would say is that we're recording on Monday. Hungary has just had an election, and Viktor Orban there, the far-right leader, who's played a symbolically really important role in the kind of MAGA movement, I guess. J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance, was just there campaigning for Viktor Orban. He lost the democratic election there in Hungary in effectively a landslide, with some of the highest turnout in the history of Hungarian democracy. And so I think Europe and European leaders will really take heart from that and see that as a symbolic and material victory against Trumpism in Europe. And it will also allow Europe to present really a more unified front, especially when it comes to Ukraine and when it comes to, the US playing a wrecking role there as well. So I think that's quite significant, and I think that will contribute to that shift underway in Europe away from the US alliance.
You spoke earlier about some of the civilian toll that we've seen and just how many people have already died. But obviously the focus internationally much of the focus has been on the Strait of Hormuz and what that's been doing to oil prices in particular. It is the place where something like 20% of the global oil and gas supplies have to transit through in order to get anywhere. How close are we to returning to free and open passage of the Strait of Hormuz?
Not very, I don't think. I think we're further away than we were even a few weeks ago. And that is because, as I was saying, that this is a strategic advantage for the Iranian regime that knows that Trump is losing interest in this conflict and that really they just have to wait him out. They have to wait for him to decide that he's ready to move on to something else, or for it to hurt him so badly domestically, which it already is, that he wants to get out. So the United States has really failed in, diplomacy 101 in understanding that there have to be some incentives provided, there have to be some concessions, some compromises. And in that failure has made the situation, I think, more and more difficult. And in instituting this apparent naval blockade has become even more of a wrecker, because those nations that have been able to negotiate safe passage and, I guess potentially open a channel for reopening the strait are being undermined now by this naval blockade as well. Trump is intent on wrecking things and not rebuilding them. So the situation is pretty dangerous in that sense, but I think it's also contributing to that shift that I was talking about where, so many nations that are grappling with this version of the United States are attempting to circumvent it and, work together in order to get the strait reopened. So the Australian Foreign Minister, for example, last week, I think it was, met with 40 or so of her counterparts in initial discussions about how to get the strait reopened. Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer are having conversations directly about it as well. So there's certainly potential that things will move, but I don't think we can rely on the Trump administration to play a constructive role there.
So we've already seen significant opposition to the war internally within the United States, including from some former Trump allies like Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Can you give us a bit of a picture of what that backlash looks like within the United States?
So I think there are two things going on there. There's what's happening inside the MAGA movement, which has always been actually quite a kind of broad coalition of interests that includes the more like libertarian wing, I guess we could call it, of US politics.
America first, let's not invade other countries brigade. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, you could kind of describe them as the more genuinely America first brigade, which includes people like the figures like Tucker Carlson, but also Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky, who's always been a bit of a thorn in the side of Trump, but who advocates for ending all foreign aid and all US involvement overseas. And so they are opposed to this war. They're also vocally opposed to US support of Israel, and particularly Israel's war on Lebanon. So Tucker Carlson has been really vocal about that, to the point where, it's got to Trump enough that he's posting long screeds about them and how they're idiots and they mean nothing on Truth Social, which was always an indication, that they're getting to the president. I think it's always been in the interests of figures like Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are ideologically aligned with Trump, but it's always been in their interests to kind of be seen as outsiders, to be seen as kind of underdogs. And so
makes them more credible amongst their own audience.
Exactly right. But they're not breaking with the Trump movement more broadly, given the choice between Trump and a more, Democratic or left-leaning politician. They will always choose Trump. Like, they'll always be on that side. So those rifts are significant, but I don't think they'll lead to any kind of permanent break or anything like that. But more broadly, it is feeding into general opposition to the war, which, like you rightly identified, and which is widespread. It is desperately unpopular with the American people, who elected Trump at least partly on a platform of withdrawing the United States from forever wars. There were Trump surrogates saying constantly that, Kamala Harris was the one who was going to send American young people to endless wars in the Middle East and that Trump would end that. Stephen Miller, one of the Trump architects, said that explicitly. And so they knew then that wars like this were deeply unpopular with the American people. They capitalized on it. And now they're facing significant backlash because Trump has embarked on this new war. And so the war itself amongst the broader population of the United States is incredibly unpopular and is becoming more unpopular, of course, as it goes on. And that's always the way American wars go. Even if they start off as quite popular, that drops off as reality sinks in. And so this is hurting Trump politically. What the consequences of that are, we can't really know because Trump is not a normal president. This is not a normal time in American politics. But it's certainly, I think he's aware of how unpopular it is. You can see that in the way he's flailing to try and justify it.
And how much does the rest of the MAGA movement, is it concerned about, for example, any implications for the midterm elections?
This is a really interesting one because I think Republicans, particularly congressional Republicans, are really worried about the midterms because Trump is already a historically unpopular president, and this is only making that worse. And in a normal US electoral cycle leading up to the midterms, we would expect to see a historic wipeout for Republicans. On these numbers alone, Democrats would sweep the House, would potentially even take back the Senate, although that's a longer shot. Which, of course, has significant implications for the second half of a Trump presidency. But I think we have to put that alongside concerted efforts by the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress to dramatically undermine the integrity of not just the electoral processes, but people's faith in those processes.
In the results as well, yeah. I mean, they've already done it once, essentially. I don't think anyone thinks they're would hesitate to repeat that kind of pattern of behaviour. I want to turn now to what this all means for the relationship with Australia, because I don't know about you, but I just don't get any sense from our government or their public statements that they're at least publicly treating any of this as kind of anything but business as usual. This is a normal administration, and what's a few threats of genocide and wiping out a civilization amongst allies?
Yeah.
I mean, is the government strategy essentially here just to wait Trump out and treat this as business as usual in the meantime?
Look, it seems to be, I think it's getting harder, obviously, to pretend that this is business as usual. But certainly when pressed on it, the Prime Minister will say he will deliver the same lines. He did this, he gave a speech at the National Press Club in the last couple of weeks and was asked about the US alliance and said, the United States is Australia's most important security partner. And that clearly hasn't changed. And there is this attempt, I think, to differentiate, not unreasonably, between the Trump administration and the alliance more broadly. But when you have your most important security ally literally threatening to commit genocide, and I think it's important to say
and
that
threatening our security, our fuel security, our energy security,
our pharmaceutical benefits scheme.
I don't understand this continued assertion when actually he's responsible for instability, for reducing our security. I feel less secure. I'm sure everyone who's filled up their petrol tank in the last couple of weeks isn't feeling particularly like Trump's an ally.
No, and I think that's key, Bob. I think Australians can see that, this all lays at the feet of the President of the United States. There's lots of kind of Australian political punditry that talks about the Labor government suffering because of the cost of living crisis, particularly rising fuel prices. But, that there is this interesting phenomenon that it's not necessarily reflected in the polling because people understand it's not the Labor government's fault. Like they understand that this is all being caused by the President of the United States. But I think what that does is highlight that jarring separation, between what the Trump administration is doing and what the Labor government is saying about, this being our most important security alliance. I think people are increasingly recognizing that those two things just aren't reconcilable.
With allies like these, who needs enemies?
Yeah, gosh, yeah. And I hope, I expect, I'm not an insider, but, I hope behind the scenes, there is a lot of scrambling happening and there are a lot of phone calls being made to counterparts in the United States that are saying, what are you guys doing? You are making this so much worse for your allies and yourselves. And I think particularly, where Australia is concerned, that became really serious when Trump made that threat to erase a civilization because how do you do that? How do you erase a civilization overnight? You don't do that with conventional weapons. You know, if you're really committed to doing that, which Trump, appeared to have been, then you do it with nuclear weapons. And that raises significant questions for Australia because of our integration into signals intelligence, particularly through Pine Gap, through joint facilities. What does it mean if the Trump administration orders a nuclear strike and potentially that order is going through Pine Gap? Now, we wouldn't necessarily know that, but it's a possibility. And for that to have happened would raise very, very serious questions for a Labor government, particularly a Labor government that has a very proud history of being vocally opposed to nuclear proliferation. So there are some pretty big questions being raised. And again, I really hope behind the scenes, some people are having some pretty serious conversations about what that would mean. And, maybe that is reflected publicly, Eb, where in as much as the Labor government, is saying all the same lines about the alliance in the United States, there has been, I think, a quiet walking back of that initial support. The Australian government was one of the first to come out and support Trump's war on Iran. It has since quietly walked back that support and is now using phrases like de-escalation and inappropriate language, which, are not particularly strong, but in the context of what we've heard before, it is, I think, at least attempting to send a signal. Even as the Australian Prime Minister was going to Singapore to shore up Australian fuel supplies, even as the Foreign Minister is meeting with 35, 40 of her counterparts around the Strait of Hormuz. They're doing that diplomatic work, and Australia can play an important role in doing that. But it is, I think, potentially undermined when above that all is that refusal to really name, why this is happening, and that this is happening because our most important security ally is behaving in the most appalling ways and, as you said, directly threatening the security of Australians.
So I've kind of been critical of the government's, what I feel is very muted response to this insanity. But also, I'm really struck that in foreign policy circles, it just seems like there's just no alternative to the United States. We just have to just lump it, basically. Is it really that binary? Is there no alternative out there for Australia?
Well, certainly that's the way foreign policy pundits would describe it. Even those of my colleagues in this space who are rightly just as appalled by what Trump is doing as the rest of us, they will still say, but what's the alternative? We have no choice but to seek out the protection of the United States because there's nothing else. I just don't buy into that, this idea that, it's either all the way with the United States or we're completely alone in the world. That's the binary that we're presented with. I think, what Trump is demonstrating to us every day over the last couple of weeks is that it's not Australia that's isolated. It's actually the United States that is incredibly isolated. So much was made in the last week or so of Trump, standing up at the podium and talking about all the allies that didn't help the United States in Iran.
It's not just NATO. You know who else didn't help us? South Korea didn't help us. You know who else didn't help us? Australia didn't help us. You know who else didn't help us? Japan.
Almost every interview I did about that in the Australian media, I kept saying, what do we make of the Trump administration singling out Australia for criticism? And my response to that is, well, he didn't single out Australia, really. He put us on quite a long list of countries that included every member of the NATO alliance except the United States, and just showed us how isolated he has made the United States, that actually Australia has ready allies who are all trying to grapple with what this means and how we might build a more peaceful world. And so I think that, therein lies the answer. And the Australian government is doing some of that work. And there's no reason that they can't do more or be stronger, I think, in building those relationships and those alliances.
I feel like we should touch on AUKUS, but is there any movement on that? Is there any real updates, or are things just chugging along as normal there?
Things appear to be chugging along as normal. I think AUKUS is clearly at least part of the reason that the Australian government is unwilling to use stronger language, to push back against what the president is doing and what the president is threatening, because there's this fear that, that might endanger the AUKUS deal. I don't think Trump is paying any attention or particularly cares, but the commitment is clearly still there from the Australian government, and that they will increasingly try and separate, Trump as something to be waited out, and AUKUS is something bigger than him. And I mean, in timelines, it is. It's just raising very immediate questions for Australian sovereignty in particular that the government clearly doesn't want to talk about. So no, AUKUS appears to be just chugging along, but I suspect that public sentiment around AUKUS is changing pretty significantly as the Trump administration continues to show us, what it is willing to do and how it is willing to treat allies.
So we've talked a little bit about how Europe is kind of pushing back in the different ways that it's, I guess, not only had to prepare for a potential US invasion of Greenland, but also things like, I know they're considering how they can decouple themselves from the US financial payments system and less dependence on, for example, the Microsoft Office suite for everything that they do, and forging a more independent path for itself. But to take us back to kind of where we started, which was this illegal war and its ramifications, there's been a lot of talk now about how our previous rules-based order and the international system has been damaged beyond repair. What role does Australia have to play in shaping what comes next?
I mean, that is essentially up to Australia, isn't it, Eb? We could choose, our government could choose to play an absolutely central role in building new institutions of law, new rules for the way that we conduct ourselves in the world, much in the way that Australia did at the end of the Second World War. Australia was front and centre in building the UN Charter, for example, and we have I think a wellspring of respect and agency that we can tap into. We have significant contributions to make diplomatically and in other ways. It's just that, we have to choose to do that because it's risky, and it is scary attempting to build something in the face of such wrecking and such destruction from the Trump administration. But, the alternatives are pretty bleak.
And certainly not saying anything hasn't seemed to spare anybody at any point.
No, exactly right. Trump keeps showing us it doesn't matter how much you give him, nothing is ever enough. It doesn't matter how much you cower. He'll eventually, he'll turn on you like he turns on everybody else. And I think there's a real appetite amongst Australians, amongst people across the world for a much more constructive approach to how we relate to each other in the world. I think it's worth emphasising that nobody, I don't think people want to live in the kind of world that Donald Trump is creating, a world where violence decides, who's in charge, a world where people don't get an opportunity to build a better life for their children. That's not what people want. And I think there's real political will and political space for that to be asserted. As we've said, there are so many ready allies who I think would be willing to work with Australia on this and already are in many spaces. And there's no reason that can't be expanded and Australia can't play a really big role in it.
Thanks so much for joining me, Emma.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Eb.
And if you want to read more about the Australia-United States relationship, Emma's Vantage Point essay has recently gone to reprint. So you can grab After America, Australia and the New World Order for just $19.95 from Australia Institute Press. Pod listeners can use the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout to get free shipping. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 13th of April, 2026. God knows what Donald Trump will do in the next 24 hours before we actually publish this episode. But our theme music, as always, is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.